There are few moments in Star Wars more haunting than Yoda's duel with Darth Sidious, the Grand Master of the Jedi Order. A being who had spent centuries preparing to destroy the Sith was forced to flee in defeat. But the true horror of that battle wasn't just that Yoda lost, it was what the fight revealed to him. For the first time in his extremely long life, Yoda realized that he had been beaten on a fundamental level. Sidious hadn't just outdueled him, he had outmaneuvered the Jedi across the entire galaxy, exposing every weakness of their order, and proving that a millennium of Jedi wisdom had ultimately failed to stop the Sith. In fact, that instant, Yoda saw himself as a complete failure, and saw Sidious as something new, the impossible made real. The Sith had evolved, the Jedi had stagnated, and Yoda, the greatest of them all, had no answer. What terrified Yoda the most wasn't Sidious's lightning, but the realization that he had been fighting a war that no Jedi alive could ever hope to win. But Yoda did have a plan. It simply no longer involved crossing blades with the Dark Lord again, because that contest was already decided. To face Sidious a second time would have been to repeat the same failure, and Yoda knew it. Instead, he would have to learn from his rival. That victory would not come through brute strength or open confrontation, but he would win a different way. Greetings lore junkies and students of the Force, and welcome back to the archives. At the end of Revenge of the Sith, two duels determined the fate of the galaxy. Obi-Wan Kenobi faced his fallen apprentice on Mustafar, and Yoda entered the Senate chamber to confront Darth Sidious, no longer just Chancellor, but Emperor of the Galaxy. Both fights carried symbolism. Obi-Wan's duel with Anakin was the breaking of a brotherhood, a tragedy of love and betrayal. Yoda's battle with Sidious was something larger, the final clash between the Jedi and Sith after 1,000 years of shadow conflict. And yet, their outcomes could have not been more different. Obi-Wan triumphed, but Yoda didn't destroy the Emperor. Instead, Yoda fled, beaten, shaken, vanishing into exile for the rest of his life. So why? Why did the most powerful Jedi ever never return to face the Emperor again? The truth lies not only in the duel itself, but in what Yoda realized during the duel, and in the overwhelming shadow that Palpatine would cast after. The imagery of the duel is extremely deliberate. On Mustafar, Obi-Wan held the high ground against Anakin. He warned his apprentice not to attack, knowing the outcome would already have been decided. But Anakin, driven by arrogance and the dark side, was like a drug. He ignored the truth, and he lost everything. In the Senate chamber, Sidious held the high ground against Yoda. As the fight escalated, the Emperor hurled entire pods through the air, laughing as he rained destruction from above. Yoda fought valiantly, even matching Sidious blow for blow. But when the final torrent of lightning struck, he was blasted back and forced to cling to the edge of the Senate pod. In that moment, Yoda made the opposite choice of Anakin. He did not try to prove himself. He did not try to best Sidious from a position of weakness. Yoda saw the truth, he recognized it, and Yoda lived. But the truth Yoda saw was far more devastating than simply losing the high ground. The Revenge of the Sith novelization by Matthew Stover gives us the clearest window into Yoda's thoughts in this moment. In the heat of the battle, Yoda is struck not just by Palpatine's power, but by what the power represents. Finally, he saw the truth. This truth that he, the Avatar of Light, the Supreme Master of the Jedi Order, the fiercest, most implacable, most devastatingly powerful foe the darkness had ever known, just didn't have it. He had never had it. He had lost before he started, before he was born. The Sith had changed, they had grown, they'd adapted and had invested 1,000 years intensive study into every aspect of not only the Force, but the Jedi lore itself. In preparation for this exact day, the Sith had remade themselves. They had become new. The Jedi had spent the same millennium trying to refight the last war. The new Sith could not be destroyed by a lightsaber. They could not be burned away by any torch of the Force. This realization shook Yoda to his core. It wasn't that he was too old or too weak or simply unlucky. The truth was worse. The Jedi had already lost long before he ever set foot in the Senate chamber. For 1,000 years, the Jedi had been stagnant, clinging to tradition, preparing to fight the Sith as they once were. Meanwhile, the Sith evolved. They studied the Force, their enemies, and the very structure of the Republic. They prepared not just to fight the Jedi, but to annihilate them from within. By the time Yoda crossed blades with Sidious, the war was already decided. Even if Yoda had somehow killed Sidious that day, then what? The Republic had already embraced the Empire. The Jedi were branded as traitors, hunted by the clones. Sidious had manipulated the galaxy so perfectly that his death would not undo this victory. At best, Yoda could have hoped for a stalemate, but against an emperor who already controlled the Republic, the Senate, and the military, a stalemate was indistinguishable from defeat. And so Yoda did not try again. he understood what Anakin had not. Sometimes to attack from a position of weakness is to throw away everything. He escaped with Bail Organa not to surrender, but to preserve himself for the future. This was not fear of Sidious's lightning or his blade. Yoda had faced dangers for centuries. What terrified Yoda was the recognition that his entire order, his philosophy, that is what failed. The Jedi could not save the Republic. The Jedi could not win this war. This is the fear that Yoda carried into exile. Not as a coward, but as a teacher. He accepted that his time as a warrior was over. The Jedi of his generation had failed. Only the next generation, unburdened by the Jedi stagnation, could ever succeed. And so he hid on Dagobah, preparing not to destroy Sidious himself, but to guide Luke Skywalker when the time came. Meanwhile, Palpatine's power only grew. The duel with Yoda had been his final test, and from then on, his rule was uncontested. By seizing the Jedi Temple, Sidious gained unrestricted access to the Jedi archives. Here lay millennia of Jedi wisdom, histories, and guarded knowledge of the Sith. All of it was now his. Where the Jedi had once suppressed dangerous lore, Sidious studied it freely, openly, deepening his mastery of both orders. And beyond knowledge, he now commanded endless resources. The full might of the Empire's fleets, armies, spies, and industry all bent to his will. If Yoda ever revealed himself, Sidious would not only descend as a Sith Lord, but with the crushing weight of an entire galactic superpower. Yoda understood this. His presence alone could have doomed the early rebellion. If he had stood with them openly, Palpatine would have taken the threat seriously, deploying overwhelming forces to stamp out before they could ever gain momentum. But what's most chilling is that Sidious himself took great pleasure in Yoda's survival. Behind closed doors, the Emperor was glad that the Jedi Master had lived. Why? Because Yoda's exile was not a victory for the Jedi. It was proof of their defeat. The greatest Jedi in history forced to watch helplessly as the galaxy bent to Sith rule. This was a living trophy. To Sidious, every year Yoda endured in silence was another reminder that the Sith had won. This was the ultimate cruelty. Yoda's continued survival, meant to preserve hope, became for Sidious a source of amusement. The Emperor knew Yoda was out there, but he did not fear him. Instead, he relished in the thought that the Grand Master was reduced to watching, unable to act. Watch as everything he fought for crumbled. And yet, Yoda's choice would prove to be wise. By removing himself from the fight, he ensured the survival and the knowledge of the Jedi. He communed with Qui-Gon's spirit, learning to preserve his identity after death. He meditated on the failures of the Jedi, preparing to pass on what wisdom he could to Luke. And when Luke finally arrived on Dagobah, Yoda did not train him to be a general or a soldier. He trained him to face the darkness in a way the old Jedi never could. And in the end, it was not Yoda or Obi-Wan who destroyed the Sith. It was Luke's compassion and Anakin's redemption that brought Sidious down. So why did Yoda never face the Emperor again? And why was he terrified to do so? Because in their duel, Yoda finally saw the truth. The Jedi had already lost the galaxy. The Sith had evolved, the Jedi stagnated, and the Republic itself had embraced the dark side. To fight again would not have changed anything. At best, it would have ended in another stalemate. At worst, it would have doomed the very future that Yoda was trying to preserve. The Rule of Two had not been a simple restructuring of Sith hierarchy, but a reimagining of the entire conflict between Jedi and Sith. Where once armies of Sith Lords clashed openly against Jedi, Darth Bane's doctrine ensured secrecy, patience, and the long game. By concentrating power into a master and apprentice, the Sith had shifted from brute military opposition to ideological infiltration, subterfuge, and political corruption. This transformation meant that the Jedi were no longer fighting warriors. They were fighting shadows, manipulations, and enemies who struck from within the very heart of the Republic. It changed the shape of the war itself, forcing the Jedi into a struggle that they were unprepared to fight. Sidious, believe it or not, elevated this reinvention. He did not merely continue the Rule of Two, he weaponized it finally into a galactic strategy. Sidious orchestrated the Clone Wars so that no matter who fought or who won, the Sith always remained in control. Yoda, facing him, realized in that moment that it was not just another duel of blades or even the Force. It was a battle already lost because the entire framework of the war had been rewritten around the Sith's very designs. Outmatched politically, militarily, and spiritually, Yoda saw that survival, not victory, was the only path forward. In exile, he borrowed from the Sith's own tactic, vanishing into the shadows, knowing that only by waiting, by hiding would the Jedi ever return. And so Yoda refused to ever engage the Emperor ever again, not out of cowardice, but out of wisdom, a fear of the consequences. He turned his terror into patience though, waiting for the day that the next generation would rise. Palpatine grew stronger, fed on knowledge, commanding the galaxy itself, mocking his rival's helpless exile. But Yoda endured, preparing for the next generation, preparing for Luke. In the end, the choice was the right one. The Jedi of his generation could not win this war, but through Luke Skywalker, Yoda ensured that the Jedi legacy and the hope of the galaxy would never die. But anyway, my friends, what are your thoughts on this? We wanted to make a sort of sequel video to why Obi-Wan never joined the rebellion, although for Yoda it's a little bit more clear. Still though, he put a lot of time, effort, and thought into not joining the rebellion, actually taking a page out of the Sith's book instead, which I find to be extremely fascinating. But anyway, my friends and fellow lore junkies, thank you so much for visiting the archives with me here today, and as always, may the Force be with you.